Hi. This is another one of those videos that it has been difficult to complete. Lots of beginnings, lots of interruptions, and not much possibility of editing this sort of video back together in a coherent form or any of the things that I recorded, like while driving around and sitting in vets' offices and things. So bear with me. This is what I think of as a considered reflection. Okay. I have considered many of the points within it several times while trying to put together my report on play. While I really value the immediate reflections for their ability to demonstrate what was important in the moment and what really needed to be said immediately following play, perhaps a greater value to the overall purpose of the reflection is this sort of reflection, the considered reflection. Because after all, each participant in a group activity is only seeing the activity through a narrow window of perception. And it's not until we open our ears and our eyes to the experience of the others, until we engage our empathy and begin to connect with what other people are experiencing during play, do we begin to get that glimmer of what's really going on. I think far too often people rush in to wanting to put their own particular interpretation on an experience, and so miss out on a lot of not just nuance, but a lot of the actual components of that experience. So that's one of the reasons why these reflections get made. So, court of opinion was a small course correction and adjustment based on these kinds of observations of the play so far. So, the major thing that I was adjusting personally was how I was using threat and the depth, not finding the right word that I want, but the adjusting something about preparation. I'll get to it in a minute. In terms of adjusting threat, I chose to spend it in smaller increments more often on things of less import. So, in other words, I used it less to adjust context, and I used it more to adjust potential for complication or as a more obvious threat, such as bringing in reinforcements. In terms of the preparation, in each of the 3 episodes so far, the preparation has been the same in that it has focused only on starting situations. But in this case, I stripped it down to the starting situation being as unconnected to other things as possible, which allowed us, the freedom to go anywhere that the increased complication range that I was planning to spend thread on might take us. Whether or not that will work in the long term, or whether I'll have to continue to make course corrections to be somewhere between what I did in this episode and what I had been doing previously, remains to be seen. And that's part of the fun for me, is being able to pay attention to play and adjust play to get a stronger sense of connection with the other players during play, that we're having fun now without the need to talk about it or announce it. Okay, another part of this evaluation process included asking the players questions about the campaign experience on a specific level, such as we've lost a member, do we want to replace that member? We are seeing this type of play and this type of play, these approaches to how we talk to each other in play. Which do you prefer, right? And the loaded question, do you want to continue play. And so that's where we are. Another part of this self-evaluation process that I routinely do, but I don't usually broadcast, this time I chose to make a video about. I went through and reviewed errors. These are important errors that I've made with the rules during the run of this campaign. Here they are. Not as an excuse or, oh, I did this because, but simply to say, look, these are errors that I made. Are you making them too? Help me not make them in the future, and that sort of thing. Did you see any other errors that I'm making of this type? Let me know. So I find this process to be really valuable into taking awareness of the game through familiarity with the game into skill with the game. I'd like to be skilled with the games that I play, and this is one of the ways that I get there. So we're talking a lot about learning. So a lot of the reason why we are playing is because I wanted to share what this game can offer to willing participants with some willing participants. And the point we are now, around 12 sessions in, somewhere during this episode, we reached the point of the learning process where people are beginning to realize things, like discover things that you've already told them. And, it puts everybody in the awkward position of you saying or not saying, I told you that. And, as someone who works training people, this is a situation that I'm very, very familiar with. It's not a source of frustration. It's just a point of recognition that this is one of the stages along the path of learning. So it's a good sign. So what this shows us is that in any learning endeavor, there are types of listening, there are types of attention, and there are points where our ability to take in information is overwhelmed. There are approaches to learning which are less suited than others. And there is engagement with learning as a participant rather than a recipient, which can facilitate or hinder or whatnot the learning process. It is a process. And I find that we tend to shy away from the idea of learning as an active thing when the activity that we're trying to learn is supposed to be fun. Like, why can't we just play? And, well, we can get to a point where we can just play as we complete the process of learning, right? There's more comfortable, more entertaining, easier, broader, more varied, more stimulating play ahead once we've reached not just familiarity with the rules, but the point where we're actually playing with them. And then beyond that, the point where we're not considering them like, well, if I do this, and then I do this, and then I could connect with that, and then maybe, right, where we have integrated our desires as players, our qualities as characters, and the characteristics of the system into play. There's no reason why a group can't reach that level, unless, of course, there's some aspect that's holding them back, such as the setting isn't as interesting as they thought, or they don't have time, or they've suddenly had a baby, or whatever. Okay, so we've reached that point in the learning cycle, and I'm having more time to think about my play on the action, reaction, interaction level as the game master, because we're talking less and less about rules and rules implications and rules options, and we are doing less overt reminding of things. And so there's more play, plus there has been more time for play. So originally we were having difficulty getting toward 90 minutes, and during this episode we were more often around 2 hours. And although it's only like a 30-minute difference, 30 minutes to an hour difference, it's pretty significant in terms of what can be done. Curiously, as heavy as Star Trek Adventures can seem from the outside, and certainly from reading it or looking at the core book, in play it's actually very fast, and we're still playing it very slowly, and yet a lot of things of import are being done. So it's pretty cool. So in those moments where the group is listening to each other and in tune with the idea of learning, and they're cooperating all together, the game has been a lot of fun. When those things have broken down, when there's some kind of resistance to learning, such as with Starship Combat in an earlier episode, when there is hesitance or doubt about the way things are being done, or why things would be done a certain way, or whatever, then of course play is less satisfying. I mean, these are just things to be aware of. This is not like the pointing finger of blame. It's like, in the 5th minute of the 3rd session of the 8th game, that's counterproductive and kind of ridiculous. But through this process of play, immediate discussion as the close of play, and then reflection between periods of play, it's really possible for a group to find its way to play with each other. It just requires a little bit of attention, some active listening, empathy, and a position for play can be reached which is far more comfortable and beneficial than what we commonly see out there, what is just accepted as play. And so that kind of stuff is important to me. All right. I guess the last thing to talk about is that, weirdly, this episode became a two-parter. And there is a reason for that, and that's simply that I realized as I was reaching the point where it felt like the session should end, I wasn't really aware of how much time had passed in a realistic sense. Like, oh, we've been playing for 2 hours, it's probably time to end because we all have responsibilities. It was more that we were reaching a part of play that really felt like an end. And as soon as that thought crossed my mind, it's like, yeah, and it feels like the end of an episode. And then I recognized that everything that had come up during the episode that's solely related to the episode, whether it was inspired by the opening situation or simply just occurred during the episode, those things had, to use a word, those things had reached some point of satisfying resolution. They had been acted upon, they had been interacted with, they had been reacted to in some measure, and for now, at least, or maybe forever, they had been resolved. They're not all problems, but I'm going to use the word resolved in this video just for the sake of brevity. So, all of those things had been resolved. But the continuing elements, the things that were introduced into the campaign from character creation and onward, those things that had put in an appearance in this episode had also been interacted with. They weren't just informing some decisions or characterizations. They had become things that were in the foreground. We were acting upon them, we were reacting to them, and we were interacting with them. And those things had also changed. They had evolved. They weren't resolved, obviously, by their nature, as they're far broader than a single episode. But they had evolved. They had become different, and in a way that was compelling enough to want to make the next opening situation of the next episode about them. And so it's got to be continued. So I found that pretty interesting, as, if nothing else, an indicator of how playing the game, using the conceit of a Star Trek adventure being an episode of a TV series. How the episodic logic can begin to color our senses of play. Now, there's a good side, which I consider this to be, but there's also a bad side, which I talk about in the preparation video, which is I don't want the number of sessions to dictate the events of play. I don't want a climax or a combat or an argument, right, or an injury to become the end of an episode because it took place in the fourth session or the third session or whatever, right? I don't want the number of sessions. I don't want the amount of playtime to dictate the interpretation of in-game events. So, in a sense, it bothers me that the pilot was 4 sessions, episode 1 was 4 sessions, and now episode 2 is 4 sessions. That bothers me a little bit, but at the same time, the conditions of play in each of those episodes was quite different. Number of players was different. Rules familiarity was different. Pace was different. Length of play was different, and the amount of material created or interacted with in play was different. And so, although they are 4 sessions, not all sessions are created equal. So it's pretty interesting to reflect upon. There's probably a lot more that can be said about play, about character, about connecting our play through character and the mechanisms of play in the system to the experience of Star Trek television. But that should probably be its own, upon reflection, that should probably be its own video. All right. So in terms of what happened and how it went, as you can see from the backdrop behind me, the characters were on Starbase 11. The Avicenna had been redirected there for much needed rest and relaxation. But, of course, the main characters and many of their closely associated supporting cast didn't get much rest or relaxation. They had other things to do. So Yang was presented with an opportunity to show off. He had an opportunity to impress the brass, running a training seminar based on his experiences during the pilot for a bunch of cadets. Well, based primarily on the dice, this situation became complicated. And so interpreting the dice indicating that there's a complication here, and there's a serious complication here, it made sense to me as the game master to connect that complication not to something like physical harm or poor performance in his duties, but rather to a complication of performing his duties. So the cadets transformed from cadets into cadets like Yang is perceived to be, right? Ambitious, seeking promotion, seeking command of his own someday, with powerful and connected parents. So the class transformed through complication into a appropriately Yang-shaped problem. Would he be able to solve it? And this complication spread out so that it connected with his powerful parents, and there was the risk of it, ending his dreams and ambitions of promotion within Starfleet to, along the command track. It was something that he needed to act upon. So I hope that that was an engaging challenge for the player. For Korsakov, this is a character whose backstory involved an alien artifact. Now, the standard interpretation of the alien artifact is that it's like the city on the edge of forever, where the character has had an experience with some kind of alien civilization. Ron, however, wanted to have it as an object, and he wanted to keep it hidden. So that inspired the creation of this scandal and the removal, in combination with our now absent third player's backstory, the removal of the previous commander. And so those things all bound together into this scandal with this hidden artifact that raises people from the dead, and they come back wrong, and that sort of thing. So he was called as a witness, but rather than have this be a situation where Korsakov has to stand up and retell this story that we already know, he was called as a witness to support the former captain of the Avicenna, Stian Anders, who was relieved of duty by its current, although temporary, commander. Well, that had every potential of spiraling into something. So, the mainly decisions, but also the dice for Ron caused that to become not really a mistrial, but it caused the hearing to be stopped in order for an investigation into what really went on to be implemented. And that spiraled into a rather explosive conclusion to the episode, which was set up to, that explosive conclusion was set up to destroy the artifact. I find that interesting. In my experience with a lot of games based on mystery and the occult, and certainly not balanced games where there is a challenge rating where if we do things correctly we can expect to overcome all of the creatures on this level. Playing from an unbalanced perspective, it's interesting how things like violence and destruction manifest, whether this is an expression of the players and or characters' fear that there's nothing that they can do, and so they resort to pretty over the top solutions, or it can represent a dislike of direction of play, and so it's an attempt to stop it, to exert some control through the vehicle of character on play and whatnot. Sometimes it's simply a dramatic response to a dramatic element. It's an appropriate response to a terrible situation. So when we think about Star Trek and we think about things that are mysterious and have vast and misunderstood powers, when we think about how these are treated in the original series as kind of a template for what would be expected from play in a Star Trek universe, we can see examples of destruction. We got to blow it up, and we can see examples of why can't we all get along. And maybe in the middle, we see investigation leading to realization that we can get along, or realization that we must blow it up. Here, we skipped a lot of the investigation and delving into mystery and went straight for we must blow it up. So I have a little bit of sadness about that. But at the same time, it was a very exciting, explosive conclusion to part one of the episode. Well, what else is there to say? All of this coincided with a self-reflection and a game reflection cycle on my part. This is a normal, not habit, but it's a normal process of mine where, at certain points in the life of a campaign, I check in with the players to see how things are going, how they're feeling, if there's anything that needs adjustment, or if there's anything, that they particularly liked about something. And I also look at myself to see if I'm, using the rules correctly. This time I made a video about it called "How's My Driving," and or I look at specific rules mistakes and that sort of thing. I think that in part and parcel of this desire to reach that point of integration between players' interests, the actual character and setting, and what the system does in play and how it matters in play. The desire to reach that point kind of requires this sort of, it's not terribly serious analysis, but this sort of evaluation of play and discussion and interaction with the other players about their experiences, so that these bonds of connection can be established within the game and with the game, but also with people. So, Court of Opinion has ended, and yet it will continue into a second part. I don't know if it will carry the same title, like if it'll be Court of Opinion Part 2. It might, but the titles are informed in part by the opening situation and in part by the events of play, and they're open to change because they're signals from me about the themes that I'm using to help shape and render coherent the improvisation that takes place in play once we get through the opening situation. So, as always, if anything that was reflected upon is unclear, if you'd like to engage in discussion about the concepts I talked about, the experiences that as I perceive them, please leave a comment below or seek us out on Adept Play.